Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the RSA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here for today's very special RSA Commencement event. The curators of our events programme have decided that one can never be too long in the tooth to hear some valuable life lessons. So they've revamped and reworked the US-style commencement address for audiences of all ages, and indeed we have an audience of all ages. So whilst you won't be walking out of this lecture hall clutching a mortarboard and a diploma, you will, however, be the proud recipient of some pearls of wisdom to help you navigate your way through life. Before we begin, could you switch your mobile phone to silent, but don't turn it off because you are invited to tweet. The hashtag is RSA Commencement. This event's also being live streamed, so welcome to our online viewers. And the event, as always, will be available to watch again on our website in a few days' time. Now, housekeeping notices over. I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming the star of today's show, Michael Rosen. He's a colossal figure on the British literary scene. He barely needs any introduction, so I'll just cover the basics. Michael is one of the UK's best-loved writers and performers. He's the author of over 100 books, mostly for children. He was the 5th Children's Laureate and is currently Professor of Children's Literature at Goldsmiths. Michael, we are delighted to have you here today to deliver this RSA Commencement address. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michael Rosen.
Matthew, thanks very much for that. Thank you, RSA, for having me, and thank you all for coming. My mother was a primary school teacher, but when she was in her early 40s, she took study leave to do a diploma in primary education at the Institute of Education here in London, with a person who, for us at home, seemed unfathomable and mysterious, a man called Christian Schiller. I was around 16, and the first immediate consequence of my mother's studies was that I found that I had to get my own tea, a lot more than I had done previously. The next was that my mother started to talk in an unfathomable and mysterious way. These speeches, if you like, would surface sometimes after she had spent half an hour or so staring into the middle distance. I remember coming home from school once. The house was dark and I thought no one was in. I opened the door to the living room and saw that my mother was sitting there and she hadn't turned the light on. I asked her if she was okay, and she said she was fine. Later, I heard her say to my father, and I'm quoting, "It's all a matter of doing and thinking." My brother, the family satirist, had tuned into this way of talking, and he had started a new comedy routine where he would pretend to be my mother, look into the distance and say, "Harold, it's all a matter of being and seeing. No, Harold, what it is talking and walking," and so on. At the time, I had no idea what my mother was talking about. My notion of what ideas or knowledge was wrapped up in senior school type problems like the downfall of Antony and Cleopatra or the unification of Italy. To my mindset at the time, a phrase like doing and thinking wouldn't or couldn't capture anything that I thought worth knowing. And yet for the last 50 years, I can see that whether I knew it or not, the phrase has been some kind of pole star for me. I grant straight away that there is a problem in the idea that you might be locked into following a guide that you don't know you're being guided by, but let's leave that for a moment. So from the vantage point of now, what do I think my mother was on about? I think she was expressing what might be called the activist thesis, which in summary, or in my own words, as the best teachers always said to us, goes something like this. Inactivity of any kind, imagine throwing a ball or squeezing a sponge, say, we get our minds and bodies to go through actions. The way this involves our minds seems to involve such things as memory, recall, observation, response, reflection, interpretation, evaluation, as well as a synthesis of some or all of these. Yet none of these is entirely separate from whatever it is that our bodies are doing. So even as we say a word like observation, we need to understand that it means observing something from the inside of what it is our body is doing. So it follows that if children become engaged in doing interesting and challenging things, their thinking will develop. As my mother was a primary school teacher, she was much concerned by the environment of the classroom. This I know because whenever we went on walks, she said she'd collect bits to take into school. She was, of course, interested in the collective of children she was in charge of for the year and how they could all make advances in that time. For her, I know it was especially important that it was all the children. So as anyone knows who's been in that situation or anything like it, a teacher has to address the matter of how this group of children coexist and cooperate. At which point another of my mother's principles comes to play a crucial part as expressed by her or my brother or both as talking and doing and thinking. And as she sat in the dark and amalgamated what she was learning from Christian Schiller, her fellow students, with her 12 years or so of teaching experience, she included in the mix that her flock had to feel that they were allowed or entitled to experiment with what they could do, with what they could talk about, and with what they could think. Again, the talking and thinking will develop out of it. So let me cut to the chase. For her and people like her, the route to learning, or if you prefer it, understanding, involved the idea that children would try out things, talk about them, do them, discuss them, think about them, and though I've separated these processes out, they might do these simultaneously or in conjunction with each other. Now, I should say that I didn't ever have the conversation with my mother where we discussed all this. I left for university and got involved with trying to solve the problems of the world. I've got no regrets about that, though I regret that I think there was a part of me that thought my mother wasn't as wise or as quick-witted as my father. And so when I came back in the holidays or on visits after I'd left home, it turned out that I ended up getting in a kind of talk huddle with my father. Then by the time I was 30, she was gone. She left behind papers, stories, poems, and a book she wrote with my father about the education of primary school children, but I didn't ever have a real face-to-face chat about all this, and she didn't live long enough to see what has happened to education. Even so, when I look back, say to when I was at university, I can see that there must have been a part of me that knew that if I wanted to understand something, I had to do, I had to cooperate, and I had to talk. Take one obvious example, Shakespeare. I loved reading close textual examinations of Shakespeare plays. I still do. And of course, there are thousands of them, as we know. But I have to concede that only a few are about what it means to make a production, or what it means to sit in a theatre, or any space, and watch a production. It's as if there is some kind of invisible hierarchy between a gold standard bona fide analysis, which is about the written form of the play, and something below that which is less serious. And this is about such things as how you might turn that script into a live play, or how and why an audience experiences the passing of events and thoughts of the play in the real time of a performance. Interesting, but less important. To give you one small glimpse of what I mean, a few weeks ago, my wife and I went to see Othello at the National Theatre. I have to say that I found it an overwhelming experience. Looking back on it, I can see that bit by bit I was being wound up tighter and tighter, so that when we reached the final unravelling at the end, after the killings, and Othello realises that Iago has engineered the whole situation, or, depending on how you look at it, Othello realises that he was only too willing to believe what Iago suggested to him, it became unbearable. Then, just as Aristotle suggested thousands of years ago, as a consequence of that explosion of feeling, and in reflection afterwards, it's possible to ask questions like, what if Othello hadn't believed Iago? Or what if the bit inside us all that's a bit like Iago, or a bit like Othello, could be suppressed or avoided? Wouldn't we and the world be better? But, and this is crucial, for all this to work, as I've suggested, it took a particularly brilliant production. When Othello looked across at Iago and realised what he realised, and when in the physical real time and space of that moment we realised that he realised, the script could do its work, or as my mother would say, doing and thinking. Now that wasn't me out there acting, if only, but at university, I did quite a lot of doing around Shakespeare and other plays, producing, acting. And the more I did it, the more I reckoned I could get to a level of understanding about plays and drama that I could not get only or purely from reading the scholarly stuff. What any performer knows is that the script can be as good as can be, but it has to work on the night. Voice, movement, looks, glances, and 100 other elements. Did I absorb that from my mother? Around that time, I started to write poems. I thought I was writing wry little pieces about my childhood that adults would find interesting. The trick I was playing with is that the narrator in the poem doesn't know as much about himself as the reader. Again, I'd arrived at this point, it's dramatic irony of course, by churning up what I was reading into things that I wanted to write. Writing, or doing if you like, was in a way a kind of criticism, thinking. In fact, there didn't seem to be many adults who were interested, other than a school's radio producer and an editor of children's books. These were for children, they both said. So the poems became a book, whereupon I started being invited into schools, libraries, and on teacher training courses to read the poems. To start off with, I did this in a rather non-doing way. On one occasion, I arrived at a school, Princess Frederica, in North London, and the deputy head teacher said that the children were very excited and they were waiting for me. I thought he meant a class, but he took me through an arch, and there was the whole school, 300 of them. Mr. McAlane, the teacher, said, "Boys and girls, here's the moment you've all been waiting for." And they all roared. I suspect they roared not so much because it was me, but that they liked roaring. So I hid. I hid behind my book and started to read in my reading a poem voice. The ship in the docks at the end of the trip, the man on board is the captain of the ship. The name of the man was old Ben Brown, and he played the ukulele with his trousers down. Now, when you perform in front of 300 children, you usually have about 30 seconds to prove yourself. And if you don't or can't, it's not that they're rude or start heckling, they just start getting interested in other stuff. Their shoes, their hair, their ears, and it had started happening. I looked across to Mr. McAlane and he looked horrified. He had read the poems off the page and had interpreted that I was some kind of live wire who could electrify his school. So he seized the moment and said to the children, "No, it doesn't go like that, does it, children?" And they roared back at him, "No!" And then he did something that I've never forgotten. He danced the poem. He read it with the whole of his body, and the whole school joined in, moving and singing the poem. The ship in the dock was at the end of the trip. The man on board was the captain of the ship. The name of the man was old Ben Brown, and he played the ukulele with his trousers down. He played the ukulele with his trousers down. In that one moment, I learnt that if I was going to make contact with a live audience of children, with the words that I'd written on a page, I would have to do some serious doing. I would have to dance poems too. And if I did that, children would do that too. They wouldn't just read poems, they would do poems. Much more recently, I've been involved in writing a book about a particular aspect of language, the alphabet. Now, another side of being a child of my parents is that language was treated in our home not only as something functional, expressive and reflective, but also as something constantly provisional, if you can be constantly provisional, and endlessly malleable. My parents exchanged English words with words, expressions and songs from Yiddish, French, German, Latin and Italian. They exchanged their accents with experiments in American. My father had been in the US Army. Welsh, my father had been evacuated there. They implied in how they spoke that language was a resource. No more than that, it was a playground. When our dishwasher broke down, my mother called it a wish dasher. when she saw what a mess our bedroom was, she called it a micha de monk. When we asked her what a micha de monk was, she said it was our bedroom. When either or both of my parents heard or read or said something that seemed to them pithy or ironic or significant, they cut and pasted it into their conversations. My mother said, "Ask your father what he's doing and tell him to stop it." It was re-quoted 1,000 times. I learned that I could think of language that way too. I could make it and remake it, quote it and edit it, make substitutions and additions, switch between accents, dialects and languages. And all this activity was not a matter of being clever, for which there is a Yiddish word, knacker, which I heard directed at me many times over, believe you me. It was again a matter of doing and thinking. By doing all that stuff, it was a way of thinking about language. At the heart of it is a question about who language belongs to. A good deal of education implies that language belongs outside of yourself. It belongs to the invisible know-alls, perhaps also knackers, who set and mark tests and exams, to invisible writers of dictionaries, to the invisible writers of the scripts that teachers appear to be using in order to teach, especially when teachers say things like, "I'd prefer not to be doing this, but we have to." It's all a nonsense. Language belongs to all of us because we're the ones who use it and change it. It is at times a battleground with all kinds of instructions and demands being issued, while some contest these, while millions carry on regardless. At times it's a place of exchange, borrowing and lending between groups, between countries, and so on. It's the activity, doing, the activity of people leads them to put language to use as part of those activities, doing and thinking and talking. And yet, even if I know all this, I can find myself getting caught out. As I started work on the book about the alphabet, my first feeling was that the alphabet was something fixed. After all, people call the alphabet I've used to write this talk with the Roman alphabet. And there it is, carved into stone on Trajan's column in Rome. You can't be more fixed than that. Other than that, the Romans wrote the word Julius, as we would say, as I-V-L-I-V-S, all in what we would call capital letters. We don't write like that anymore. So, unchangeable, yet changeable. And who did the changing? Who thought up the little letters, the lower case? And the letters J, U, and W, where did they come from? Julius Caesar? Elizabeth I? Napoleon? I don't think so. Well, it took me 400 pages to find out. These changes and many more happened because, more often than not, the doers in the actual material business of getting writing onto paper and screens, scribes, printers, compositors, and today people sitting at computer terminals, decided through doing, talking and thinking that change was a good idea or even a necessity. Maybe my mother would like that. So I believe that we not only all make and change language, but that we all have the right and necessity to find out how language works by playing with it. Most classrooms I go into have a poster on the wall of especially good words, sometimes called wow words in the current jargon. I'm always curious about this. Where do these words come from? What's so good about them? Who decided that they're wow words? And why do especially good words come from outside to the children? Again, perhaps informed by my mother, I often suggest that teachers could create a magpie wall where children and the teachers collect words and phrases, things that parents have said, lines from songs, stories, poems, newspaper headlines that show interesting, exciting, odd or intriguing uses of language. As I say, poets may or may not be people with imagination, whatever that means, but we are also people on the hunt for a good way to begin a poem. Looking out for things said, written or sung out there is as good a way as any to do that. It's a way of doing language instead of just receiving it. Yesterday, I was at a teachers' conference. We were talking about reading for pleasure. It seems to be a good idea. There are vast quantities of research from all over the world which show that when children have the opportunities to choose what they want to read and have time to read it, the benefits are enormous. So though we call it something soft and cosy, reading for pleasure, it has gloriously serious consequences. Governments know this. They even put it into the kinds of documents they turn out to show that they're not entirely dominated and obsessed with measuring, classifying, selecting and segregating children. Then they do nothing about it and get on spending millions on not reading for pleasure. Reading for pleasure is a kind of doing too. The reader is active about choosing, browsing and selecting, and then active with playing with the possibilities in a text. More often than not, readers for pleasure will talk about what they read. They pass on their enthusiasms and raise queries which they try to answer, thinking. That's why reading for pleasure gets banned. At the teachers' conference yesterday, a teacher told us that she had been told by a school's inspector not to spend time doing such things as reading for pleasure because it was, I quote, a waste of time. Another told us that if she went on doing role play around stories, she would be graded as unsatisfactory, which is a shortcut to being slung out. This week I decided I am going to stop calling myself a poet or a writer or a broadcaster. I'm going to call myself a literature activist. I hope my mother would like that. No, I'll rephrase that. I'm going to suggest that all children, students and teachers, perhaps all human beings, become literature activists, doers and thinkers. I'm sure that my mother would like that even more. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was fantastic. Can we start with this question of the difference between the written word and the spoken word? Do you think that we understand that and talk about that enough?
No, nowhere near enough. In fact, one of the exciting things I've done with my MA students is to get them to make transcripts of the children talking about a picture book. Okay? And what's quite interesting, that if you, as a teacher, ask children questions and transcribe that, and then if you ask the children to talk to each other, and you're not there, but you put a wire on them, they know the wire's on them, and they talk about it, they talk in completely different ways, and the talk that they do around, say, a picture book, this could be for any age of child, suddenly starts getting rich. They start changing the language they use, and quite interestingly, they start using words and expressions that are not in the books. So they start developing phrases, and I've seen this in the transcriptions of my students' work, studying the children. But what's also interesting is the moment you look at transcripts of the spoken word, you can see that we do all sorts of things, and people have known about this for a long time, that we don't do in writing. So we interrupt each other, we don't finish things off, we use a lot of pronouns because we're waving our arms about, so we can say that and it. And we make references that I know that you know. So earlier I asked you about your dad, so we both know your dad, so we can talk about that. But if we were writing about it, I'd have to put your dad's name in, all that sort of thing. Now, the problem is that talk is not given its due award, if you like, in schools, because this stuff of children talking to each other face to face with a thing like a book or making a pot, we don't hold it, we don't preserve it, we don't transcribe it and say, wow, that's valuable. But on the other hand, anything written is immediately physical, and we stick it up on the wall or we mark it and say that the spelling's wrong and that sort of thing. And so there is a problem there, but also in trying to initiate children into the written word, I don't think we fully appreciate that for most children it's like learning a dialect. So for me, I don't speak Glaswegian or Geordie. If I go to Glasgow or Newcastle, I have to tune in, I have to have time. And there's some strange way where we think that children don't have to tune in to the cadence and the strategies of written language. All they've got to do is go b, at, bat. And then they've got it. If they do that often enough with all the letters, they'll have the written word, but they won't because they haven't got the dialect, the strategy, the prosody, whatever word you want to use, cadences and sequences. So, no, I don't think we have got anywhere near understanding the problems of 4, 5, 6 or 10 or 20-year-olds living in a spoken world and then trying to understand the written world.
Can I share with you an experience that we had? I'm a governor of one of the RSA academies. I just want to share this experience with you and ask what you make of it. So, at the governor's body, we have, generally speaking, the head boy and the head girl come and do a presentation on behalf of the pupil council. And we had a new chair of governors, and she watched the presentation, and she said, I want to do something, and it's a bit controversial, so you just have to let me do it. So, and then 2 meetings later, the head boy and the head girl come along, actually with the whole of the pupil council, about 8 pupils from the pupil council. This is in the middle of the Black Country, this school, very working class Black Country school. And what she'd done was she'd paid for someone who was an elocution expert to come in and work with those children. And so they came to the front, and instead of delivering as they normally did, they delivered in the style of speech that they had been, in a kind of, the accent had gone, but also to show what they'd learnt, they also delivered some of what they delivered in a kind of 1950s BBC Home Service accent. And then in questions, I said to them, aren't your... And it transformed, by the way in which they presented. And when in questions, I said, what about your parents and your friends? Don't they... what do they think of you talking like this? And they said, well, we talk like we normally do when we're at home with our friends. The point is, we can choose. We can choose which of these voices to use. And it seemed to be the most remarkably transformative thing for them. I'm just interested in your thoughts about that.
Well, first of all, the key issue is how it was done. I mean, most people are speaking several accents and dialects anyway. Most people do. I mean, a few people... Well, you can only have to listen to what George Osborne did recently, and you can hear he switches. We've done programmes on Radio 4 word of mouth and traced how the Queen has changed her accent and how Harry talks differently from William and so on. So, you know, at all levels of society, people operate with several dialects and accents and have done for years. Now, of course, schools operate, by and large, with standard English on the page, and most of the teachers will speak a form that is usually tending more towards received pronunciation than the pupils in an area where they're speaking a local dialect. So schools have always been trying to, if you like, initiate children who speak a local dialect into the national prestige dialect of spoken English and the prestige writing of standard English. So I would only say to you is I doubt whether in fact it's all that different. The only thing about elocution people is that they tend to say this is, not always, because you know I don't want to offend elocution people particularly, but they tend to say this is the right way to say it. The key thing is, I would always say, is you just have to make clear what it is. It is the prestige dialect of the educated classes of England, not Scotland and not Wales, but that's what it is. That's what you're learning. It's not some fixed moment in the firmament. That's what it is. So that's all I would say. And if it was transformatory, well, then that's very nice for them. I mean, so, you know, other people have done it through doing Shakespeare plays. Again, sorry to draw on my parents' experience. My dad taught at Walworth Comprehensive in South London, and he took Antony and Cleopatra to the sixth form there. There were sixth formers, and they performed Antony and Cleopatra, and that was a transformative moment because they wanted to find voices in order to do Antony and Cleopatra. So there are many ways of doing it, and English teachers, in spite of what you hear, have been experimenting with this for decades. And sometimes they've done it in ways where children had to recite sentences that had lots of H's in. So in London, where kids might say happy rather than happy, they would then fill the sentence with these H words, but sometimes they'd put in the tricky ones like honour and hour. So of course the kids would end up saying honour and hour. And so 30 and 40 years later, you can talk to people, say there was an ex-docker who I knew who used to recite it off and put in all the, and my enemies, because he said that we never knew which was the right one. So, you know, people have been experimenting with this for a long time. If it was transformatory, for these students, then that's great. But I suspect there's a lot more going on than just simply an elocution person coming in.
I think for them it was just a sense of control.
Yeah.
It was a sense that they had choices about how they communicated. It wasn't that they'd learned something better than something else. It was that they had that kind of choice.
But I can't believe, you see, that in this present day and age where people watch TV, listen to the radio, you can hear so many accents. You know, we can imagine a point in time, call it the 19th century or wherever, where by and large you may not have heard many other accents other than your own if you stayed in wherever it is in the Black Country, in Dudley or somewhere, you see. But nowadays you watch television, the news comes over the particular BBC English. So people are hearing it, and if you ask kids to do role plays, they can do it. I mean, I've sat in a school in Sheffield where the kids do thee and thou, or they did 20 years ago, and I got them to do thee and thous to tell me how it works, so I could hear how it works, and they could do that. And then I said, and now do another impro where you're working with the doctor. Do you speak in the same way? And they could do it.
Final question from me before I open it up. A couple of times in your talk, the image of Ken Robinson came into my mind because there were certain parallels. And why do you think the debate over education is so utterly depressing most of the time? And why is it we find it so difficult to get away from the idea that learning, that children's education is something which they endure, which is something which they do because for instrumental reasons, because it will lead to something later in life rather than for its intrinsic merits, and that it's overwhelmingly about academic, intellectual stuff rather than practical doing stuff? Why is it that we are still in these kind of false dichotomies and this dreadful debate? And will we ever escape it?
Well, hello, are they there? I mean, you're talking about a piece of cultural and political history here, aren't you? If I just tell a little tiny story, this week I was in Berlin. Massive privilege to be able to go in the footsteps of the German thinker Walter Benjamin, and I was taken to a factory that he wrote about because Walter Benjamin did broadcasts for children. It's only just been discovered, and we're going to do a program about it on Radio 4. So I went to this factory that's called Borsig, and because he wrote about Borsig. Now, I was invited in to meet the managing director. Now, Borsig was at one point one of the most famous steel factories, foundries in Europe. It made 80% of Germany's locomotives. You know, it's a huge factory. Most of the buildings are still standing. So if you could imagine a factory like that, it's now making huge boilers and machines that I can't tell you what they are for the petrochemical industry. So I meet the managing director, I think it said the Geschäftsführung, and I met him. Now, what do you think his training was? Okay, or if you like, what would he be in Britain or America? Well, he was an engineer. He was someone who'd got his hands dirty and who knew about the stuff. So when we went down on the factory floor, he started telling me the stuff the guys were doing, and at every step he kept telling me how skilled these guys were. I mean, in Britain, these people would be described possibly or probably in semi-pejorative or patronising terms. They wouldn't even be called engineers. They might possibly be called skilled workers. But he himself knew the whole business of the trade. He knew the history of his trade. He showed me paintings that were a bit like those Welsh paintings of steel foundrymen, and he was totally imbued with it. Now, why would that seem odd to me? Because in this country, you know, whenever they put microphones in front of bosses and managing directors, they seem to be people who've been on Harvard MBA courses. They don't seem to be people who've been engineers. Now, there's a historical, cultural reason for that, which probably you know better than me, but the point was this country had an empire, and it decides at various points in its history that they don't really have to do much training because there'll be money around and it just slurps about. And of course, this was the farce of the last 20 or 30 years, that we didn't need to make stuff. We don't need to make stuff. So we can have finance capital doing it all, and we know how good they are and how successful and intelligent and brilliant they are. And so, if you like, the corollary of that is that schools, there's very little prestige attached to technology. I mean, not all that much to science as it happens, but I mean, technology is like thought of as, well, not really very, very clever at all. But, you know, if you can do semi-deponent verbs in Latin, that is brilliant. And there are, of course, a school of thought that if you did the semi-deponent verbs, that's such a portable skill, and it's so adaptable to take elsewhere that you could run Borsig because you knew your semi-deponent verbs. And so if you go onto the factory floor, you don't need to actually know what's going on, you just know about life and culture and all that. I mean, that was the theory, but it comes off the strength of the empire, really, which of course wasn't very strong anyway, which is a bit farcical, yes.
Let me take 2 or 3 points together if we can, so we'll start with one there.
Michael, it's lovely to meet another wordsmith. And to hear someone talk about primary education, it usually starts around GCSE and the English teacher. But as a head teacher of primary schools, several primary schools, we had teachers. And the kids collaborated and communicated and discovered and investigated and wrote their own questions before they went down on the farm. Mike Morpurgo said they were the best groups he'd ever had because they devised their own questions. And back in the 80s, I wrote an article about finding a voice, whereby I transcribed exactly what kids were saying. And they looked at me, because I put apostrophe COS. You can't say that, miss. You can't say that. Not in writing. And they do code switching all the time. So I think the focus, well, I know the focus should be on child development, and that from birth a child is a little learning machine. And by golly, do we kick it out of them before they get to secondary.
Okay, let's just take a couple more points. Why don't you just come back to we'll take a point here.
Thank you. Susan Reed, and I'm a fellow of this society. And I just would like to say that, and I've said it many times before actually, that we seem to have forgotten in this country, going back to the Latin, that educare means to lead out and not to shove into people's heads whatever we think they should know about or be the machines about things. So we're meant to lead out what is already innate in people, and it's a huge amount. And secondly, I just wanted to make a quick story about my mother. My parents were Geordie, and I was in London as a banker, and I had a lot of American friends coming for a party. And my mother was to be heard practicing her Geordie in the bathroom. And we said, you know, what's all this about? And she said, these people are coming and they speak with American accents and I won't be able to understand them. So I thought I'd speak Geordie.
Okay, and then there's somebody there.
My name's Caroline Needham, and as part of my role as councillor, I've been into a lot of schools in Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith. And what seems to me to divide those schools that are doing a brilliant job for their community and those jobs that are less doing a good job is the ability to respect the community. We have a wonderful multicultural city with huge richness of language and children growing up to be bilingual from a very early age. And this is a huge richness. One of the difficulties is it's so little valued by our system, and that it's seen to be the schools that are favoured are those ones who have one set of values that everybody in the surrounding community has to subscribe to. And those schools that are doing, in my view, the best job are schools where it's a privilege of the teachers to work with such wonderful richness, and they value what the children bring and add to it. And I just think that there's a polarisation in education at the moment between a very traditional view of education and some wonderful work that is being done on the ground but is not being valued.
Over to you, Michael.
First of all, this business about learning and what is learning. Now, I suppose if you could imagine what the job of a Secretary of State for Education might be, let's leave people out of it just for the moment, that you would think that one of the jobs of a Secretary of State for Education is to establish, if you like, some kind of consensus, or perhaps just a debate around what is learning. Because here we have this idea of education as if it's about schools and just getting the different kinds of schools right. And then every now and then, every Secretary of State who comes in will blurt out something about learning, quite often without using the word learning. So they might just suddenly say there's rote learning, let's say, who are using the word there, but rote learning is really quite good. Or they might suddenly say, teacher standing in front of a whole class, well, that's very good sometimes. And you think, well, where does this come from? Who are they referring to when they say this stuff? Are they referring to the body of teachers? Are they referring to some fascinating empirical research somewhere? Are they referring to another country where it goes on? And very rarely do they refer to it, unless, of course, now everything is referred to these OECD tables. But the notion of what is learning is a highly debatable matter, and we are enriched merely by discussing it. And in actual fact, for teachers themselves to investigate what appears to be going on. What do we do? Do we work by a construct theory where we have constructs in our head and we adapt the constructs? Can you pour facts into people and then people can use those facts later? Can we do it a little bit, none of the time, some of the time? Or is it best to have that all the time? The stuff that I've been talking about, so-called activity-based learning, is there empirical evidence to support that? Can we look longitudinally? Can we have control groups in order to look at that? There is a massive debate to go on about that. Wouldn't it be wonderful? Tristram Hunt, there he is, a very intelligent chap. He could seize the centre ground, if you like, or he could seize the initiative and say, we've been talking about learning for the last 10, 20 years, but actually we don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. I'm going to be quite modest about it. I know I did a PhD in history, he'll say, but I'm not quite sure how it is. So let's have a big study. Let's have a national conversation or international conversation about what is learning. And then all sorts of people would appear from out of the woods, all sorts of professors and educators and so on, and people with 30 and 40 years of teaching, university people who've taught, I don't know, medicine and so on, would start contributing. We would be having a debate about what is learning, and we'd be able to get somewhere. And yet, strangely, it never happens. In the whole of the time, we've had when I was a kid, what used to happen were gigantic reports used to appear, famously the Crowther report, the Bullock report and so on, where people where they were, if you like, trying to find the best voices, the best minds to talk about, say, English teaching or FE and that sort of thing. And they did apply those ideas about learning, and they are embedded in those gigantic reports. But we dispensed with those at some point or another. About 20 years ago, we don't need those anymore. A minister knows. They just know. So it's rather bizarre. Yes, we could say the present Secretary of State does seem to work to the jug and mug theory. The child is the empty mug, the teacher is the jug, you pour the jug into the mug, done. So it does appear as if that's the system that he's working to. Now, I don't know. Where is the evidence for jug and mug theory? I don't know. Maybe he'll come up with it one day. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a lot forthcoming. But on the issue of culture, if we just, with that one quickly, yes, we keep forgetting that, of course, education is itself cultural. It is a thing. We are dispensing values, we are implying certain things. So when you stand up as a teacher in a class and you start talking and you say, this is the history or this is the language, you are making statements which are culturally loaded. And of course the children themselves and the students come with as much culture as the school offers. Now the question is it going to be an exchange or is it going to be a one-way conversation? Again, the present Secretary of State seems to think it should be a one-way conversation. Namely, education, whatever that means, is going to dispense this great chunks of stuff. He seems to be inspired by Mr. Hirsch in America, and that there is this generally agreed great stuff, and we will pump this great stuff into the children. Strangely missing seem to be much reflection on, say, technology and science. That doesn't seem to count so much as Jane Austen and, rather strangely, John Dryden. What a bizarre person that he plucked out of the bank of greats, literary greats. I read Dryden for a week and a half at university and made sure never to read him ever again. I don't know, it seems rather strange. But anyway, there you go. So these names are plucked out of the ether, and this is what a school does. Meanwhile, as you say, you can be full of a class full of bilinguals. So we might think, how could we harness this incredible knowledge about language that is sitting in this room? Many teachers, me included, would stand in front of a class, and I'm not bilingual, and there are these kids with this extraordinary skill. How could we harness that? It is, in the modern world, to be bilingual is a fantastic achievement and a fantastically useful thing to have. On the one hand, you hear ministers talking about, we all need to have languages so that we can trade with the Chinese. We've all got to go and trade with the Chinese now. So wouldn't it be good? Boris says, yes, learn Chinese, very good, very good. Forgetting the fact that, of course, there's quite a few kids in London schools, for a start, who are of Chinese origin, who are speaking Chinese at home. They're either speaking Cantonese or Mandarin. They're doing it at home anyway. He didn't mention that. So it's constantly the idea, well, we'll pump some Cantonese or Mandarin. They'll pump some Mandarin. So it's a bizarre way of looking at humanity, that these children arrive empty. I mean, it is a various form of cultural deficit theory. I mean, that's what keeps happening.
I mean, didn't you, though, in your talk, in a way, Michael, didn't you underline the difficulty ever of really knowing whether learning works? A few weeks ago, I moved into a house and it had picture rails. And I suddenly remembered that I'd had at the bottom of a toolkit that I've had for about 40 years, those things that you put onto picture rails, those little S things. Yes, I'm sure they've got a proper name. And the point is this, I had never thought I'd ever used them, but somehow I'd left them, and you were describing a similar thing, that in a way you learn something and for 30 years you forget all about it, and then suddenly, when you need it, it pops back again. At the same time, there might be something you've used for 30 years which you suddenly decide, my goodness, I wish I'd never learned that. It's been completely useless and set me off in the wrong. So in a way, it's very hard, isn't it? We don't know until the day we die which learning is going to be useful to us.
Well, there's a what and a how there, isn't there? The what issue, which again ought to be a debate, but very rarely is these days, is that are we going to base education on a set of things, a set of studies, a set of disciplines which there is agreement about? Well, that's one way of looking at education. On the other hand, you can look at education and say, well, what we should be thinking about is how. What are the various hows that we should be helping children have? So let's say we decide that interpretation is an incredibly useful thing. So in other words, when you're faced with speeches or you're faced with topographical aspects of the landscape, how do you interpret it? Now, interpretation seems to me like very, very important, because we need to develop that. You know, people lie to us. It's quite important to find out how they lie. You can go into the countryside and you can't interpret where there's water or whether it's going to be dangerous to go that way or that way. So we constantly need interpretation. So you can ask of education, just to take that as one example, how does education do the matter of interpretation? Now, when I go look through all these teachers' documents and all the stuff that draft curricula and stuff, it very rarely deals with process. It very rarely deals with the how. So in answer to your question, picture hooks are a very tangible, object-y thing. But I'm going to guess, you see, is that you've learned to be quite adaptable. You've actually, in your life, you've learned that, well, I'm going to hang on to that because you never know, they might be useful later. Well, that's actually education, to be able to say that. So rather than saying, anything I use today I'm going to chuck away, right? Well, that's another form of thing that you can learn from present society, isn't it? You can learn consumer culture that way, but you've rejected that. You've got some old picture hook that you kept for 40 years, yeah? You did keep it, did you? Yeah, there you go, you see. So that is something you learnt, but we don't call that learning. We keep calling 1066, or was it 1065, or was it 1067? It's 1066. Great, you've got a point on University Challenge. Do you see? That's what we keep calling learning, rather than, say, example, discovery, or let's say, knowing how to browse, select, and use from a variety of texts. Now, that is an incredibly sophisticated skill. You can see 5- and 6-year-olds teaching themselves how to do it, or alternatively, you can spend a lot of time stopping them do it, which a lot of education does. It says, this is what you will now read. Read it back to me. Lovely, you now can read. Though you can't, but that's another matter. So the point is, there is very little attention in the current debate about the how and whether you carry those skills through. I mean, ironically enough, the old argument I was laughing at about the semi-deponent verbs, I mean, the argument was that by immersion in the classics and learning verbs and discovering the great things that Julius Caesar did, that those were adaptable skills, or at least it was a learning theory, and suggested that you took some portable skills with you. I mean, I might disagree with it, but on the other hand, at least it's directed to the how and the process. And again, that has to connect with learning theory, but there doesn't seem to be much interest from central government about it. There's lots of people in universities and lots of teachers interested in it, but not from central government.
I think we have time just for a last couple of questions. We'll take one there, and one. 3 questions. Make them brief because we're running out of time.
Mine was just a quick question. As an adult, how can we relearn to find our voice? and relearn that doing and thinking to be more creative.
And then, yeah. No, there. Oh, didn't you put your hand up? Yes, you did, yeah. No. Yes, that's it.
It's also, I think, about, if you're talking about poetry, Michael, you're talking about empowerment. And in schools, teachers need to be empowered themselves to ignore the instructions they're given and to take charge themselves. And why is it that teachers don't do that? Because they expect the children to. And, well, they don't, actually. So maybe when teachers actually learn how to be strong and powerful and have a voice themselves, maybe they can be the professionals in the classroom.
It is interesting, a few years ago, Department for Education asked schools to apply for freedoms, and 80% of the freedoms they applied for, they already had. It's quite interesting. Yeah.
As you continue to mature and gain new experiences, are you overly optimistic or pessimistic, or where?
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, let's end up with you. So,
Yes.
new voices. Why don't teachers themselves take a few more risks, and optimism or pessimism?
Yes, I think, I can't pass on sort of general advice about how you can empower yourself, other than that I would always say that when faced with anything that's difficult in terms of knowledge, never blame yourself, right? One of the feelings when I did postgraduate learning of one sort or another is that, you're face to face with a difficult text, let's say by Jacques Derrida or something, and then you think, what a fool, I am just such a numbskull, I can't understand that. And then you might think, well, actually, perhaps he's writing like that so that I don't understand. That is a possibility. And once you can engage with that possibility, you do find yourself empowered. And who knows, you may then get to understand it. I don't know. But there is a way that if you never blame yourself for not understanding something, that you find strategies for understanding anyway. And also, never be afraid, it's always been one of my principles, to scribble questions. I write on books. I'm one of those people who desecrate books, okay? And I write questions, and then I go back to the questions and see whether I've found out any answers. So rather than making notes that are statements, I make notes that are questions. So I don't know whether that's of any use to you. What was the second question? Remind me, sorry.
About, shouldn't teachers be a little bit braver in just
Right.
ignoring, for example, to pick a name at random, Michael Gove?
I will never blame teachers. I've been caught doing it on occasions, and I bitterly regret it. Teachers are in a situation in which there are pincer movements all over the world. Teachers, there's control at all layers of education. I don't need to enumerate it, but the case of the woman yesterday, she was going to be marked unsatisfactory for doing role play with a year one group. What does that mean? If she had unsatisfactory hovering over her, she could lose her job. I'm someone who just swans into schools, here he comes on his parachute, safaris in, does a few poems, dances a few poems, and then swans out again. There is no issue of job security for me at all. So I'm not going to blame teachers for doing things that they're told to do, with those kinds of penalties hanging over them, league tables, exam results, all that stuff. At the same time, of course, there are ways that teachers can find. The best thing teachers can do is talk to each other. And of course, quite a lot of effort is put into stopping them talk to each other, or for that matter, rating what they say. So secretaries of state, not just this one, scarcely refers to professional groups of teachers because they're going to say things they don't want to hear. So they don't listen to them and they don't ask to hear them. Okay, or for that matter, come here. Presumably they don't pop in here too often because you might say something they don't want to hear.
A couple of times.
Couple of times. How often in the last 20 years?
Secretaries of State?
Yes.
Or, from time to time. But
Yeah.
more on transmit than listen
Yes.
mode.
Yes,
generally
there you go.
speaking.
What a surprise. Yes. So, one of the things that I do, just you mentioned poetry, you see, is that there are a whole set of strategies how you face poetry. And this applies to a lot of things. It could apply to surgery, it could apply to lots of things. But that face-to-face with the poem, there is a set of things that you're supposed to do. And I say to teachers, I tell you what, just reverse it all. And just say, face-to-face with the poem, make the first question, does this poem remind you of anything that you know that's happened in your life, someone else's life, anything you've read, any telly you've seen? And then you put the learner face-to-face with the poem on a par with the poem, so that then the children or students or adults, whoever they are, share experiences of life and texts of all kinds in relation to the poem. In fact, if one of our experiences, with my wife here, when we go to the cinema, nearly always as we come out with our children, the first thing they start doing is talking about whether the film reminds them of another film. So, you know, we saw Gravity the other day, didn't we? And then they come out and then they burst out with lots of other things. Now, what are we doing? I mean, that is, in fact, high-order thinking, because what you're doing is selecting bits of text and comparing and contrasting them, the stuff we used to have to do at A-level. Some of you remember, compare and contrast the following two passages. Okay, and there they are doing it voluntarily. This is a way in which people will teach and learn doing that. We should do that around, say, poetry, or for that matter, all kinds of things. It's what good geographers do. You come into the country and say, is there anything here that strikes you as familiar? If so, why? And then you start from the place where people are at. And then you can say, have you got any questions that you would like to ask of this poem, this mountain, this test tube, this element? Have you got any questions you'd like to ask? So you gather questions up and then you say, let's see if we can find answers to any of those questions, or how shall we? Now, if you operate on that process, then teachers are empowered. So there's two levels. There's their professional associations and then there's the classroom. But yes, it is difficult. So coming to your question, sir, on the issue of whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic.
Or Gramscian.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Yes, I'll tell you why I'm optimistic. And as it happens, it doesn't come from Gramsci. It comes from one of his forebears, a man called Karl Marx, who noticed that one of the things that happens in modern society is, of course, is that we privatise and atomise everything. It's not his words, but we privatise and make things very individual, and we acquire things. But in order to produce these things, we have to come together in very large associations of one sort or another, sometimes called workers, or sometimes called professional associations, or trade unions, or whatever. That is what always makes me optimistic. So even as they try to flog iPads to everybody and privatise and marketise education, they have to bring people together inside schools or inside associations of one sort or another. And when people get together, they come up with ideas and they come up with solutions. You know, you have an institution here, you come together and you fulminate and talk and come up with ideas. That's what people do. And that's what human beings have always done. I guess that's how the wheel got invented. And so I'm optimistic in that sense, that people will come together and will one way or another come up with solutions.
And what a wonderful note on which to end the conversation. Thank you all for your questions and for joining us. As Michael said, he enjoys scribbling in books, which is good because his new book's available outside, and he can legitimately scribble in it by writing a message for you when you buy a copy. It just remains for me to ask you to join me in thanking Michael Rosen. Thank you.